Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. I'm Huck. Today we're doing my spring DNFs. So these are all of the books that I started and decided not to finish during March, April, and May. I have 8 books to talk about today, which for a DNF video like this is a little on the higher side, I think. I guess I DNF'd quite a few books during the spring. Some of them though, I have quite a bit to talk about. Some of them I don't have much to say. I just was kind of like, it's not quite for me. So hopefully this won't take too long. But let's get started. I'm just going to talk about them in the order that I DNF'd them. So the first book that I DNF'd in March was Mother Ocean, Daughter Sea by Diana Marsalis. This book I was disappointed that it was a DNF, but I was not totally surprised that it was a DNF because it's one that I found kind of randomly on thrift books. I'd never heard anything about it before, but I decided to pick it up because the main character has healing magic, and also I love this cover and the title, and they're just, you know, it just sounded like something that I would really enjoy. But I knew I was kind of taking a gamble with this because I had never heard anything about this before. Yeah, so I was not completely surprised that it ended up being a DNF, but I was kind of disappointed because I was really hoping to love it. So with this one, I got, I think, let's see, how far into this did I get? I got about 140 pages into this book. So I tried to give it a good try, but obviously ended up DNFing it. So there are a few reasons. One is that I just wasn't connecting to the main character. I thought she was kind of boring. I wasn't really interested in her. I wasn't really interested in any of the side characters that she was interacting with. There weren't a lot of them because she does spend a lot of time very isolated, but there are some side characters that she interacts with, but I also wasn't very interested in them. It seemed like most of the interactions that she had with other characters were for the sake of providing world building information instead of building the characters and their relationships. And so I just wasn't getting invested in the characters because I didn't feel like I was getting enough about them. Also, the magic in this was like kind of weird. She has this healing magic where she kind of becomes compelled to heal people. She almost gets like premonitions that she can tell someone is about to need to be healed, and she feels compelled to go to them and heal them. But afterwards, when she goes home and the next time she goes to sleep, she has these like magical dreams where a monster shows up that she has to either like resist or fight this monster, and if she can't resist or fight the monster, then she like dies in real life. And this is somehow connected to her magic. This is kind of a consequence of using her healing magic. It's not very clear as to why it is that way. It felt kind of unnecessary, but also we get like dream sequence scenes of her fighting this monster, and they were just very awkward and kind of cringy to read, and I just did not enjoy them. But then really the main reason I ended up DNFing this was because of the main love interest and the direction it seemed like the romance was going in this, because there is a romance that becomes kind of central to the plot in this. But what I discovered upon reading this is that the main love interest is already married, for one thing, and also I don't like him. Like I don't enjoy romances that involve cheating to begin with, but also his character, like, so he's married, he had like a political marriage, and he really does not like his wife, but it is not because she's a bad person, it's because they come from different cultures and have different expectations of what their marriage will be like. She comes from a culture where wives are pretty much supposed to just like embroider and like do parties and have children, and he comes from a culture where he's more expecting his wife to be like a partner in governance and things like that. And so he's very disappointed that she doesn't want to be involved in any of the politics or governance, but she thinks that she is being the best wife she can be. She's trying her hardest because she's doing all of the things her culture says a wife is supposed to do, except that she is not be able to have children. I believe that she actually has, they mentioned that in the past she's had miscarriages. But he is very disdainful of his wife. They have never communicated about the fact that they have like different cultures and different expectations of their marriage, but he just is very disdainful of her and the fact that she does like feminine activities like embroidery. And she knows that her husband doesn't like her. Like, she can tell, but she doesn't know why. And so she, like, his wife blames herself and is thinking, like, why does my husband hate me? I don't understand. I'm trying my hardest. I'm doing everything a wife is supposed to do. And it just made me hate him. And I felt so bad for his wife. And it felt like this was supposed to somehow be like a justification for why he would cheat on her or become attracted to somebody else, why he's going to start this romance with the main character. But like, that is not a justification to me at all. And I just didn't like his character, and I just felt like I could not get on board with this romance. And then also, the first time that he encounters the main character, his first impression of her is pretty much that he likes her because she's not like other girls, because she's actually useful. And I just was like, you just keep making him worse and worse. So yeah, I just couldn't get on board with the romance for this, and I already wasn't enjoying a lot of other elements of the story. It just was kind of dragging and kind of boring to me. If I had been enjoying other elements of the story, I may have stuck with it to see if somehow the author was able to turn things around and redeem this character or make him at least semi-sympathetic in any way. But I wasn't enjoying enough about other elements of the books, and I just don't know what the author would have done to like make me care about this romance at all. So this one got DNF'd. Then the other book that I DNF'd in March was People of the Book by Geraldine Brooks. This book, I also kind of went into it expecting that I might DNF it. I was kind of giving it one last chance. This is another one that I picked this one up maybe 2 years ago at a used bookstore because it was at a point when I was looking for books about books and I hadn't quite determined what it was in a book about books that I was specifically looking for. So I was kind of just picking up a lot of different things. I came across this at a used bookstore and it was like $2 or $3. So I was like, why not? I'll just pick it up. And then I proceeded to not read it for 2 years. So I put it on my spring TBR kind of as a last chance to be like, it's now or never. Either I'm going to read this or I'm just gonna finally let it go. And I didn't get very far into it. I think I got like 20 pages into this and just decided, you know, this isn't for me. I don't have like particular reasons. I don't have a long explanation. I just sort of realized I don't think this is the type of thing I'm looking for in a book about books, and I think there's a reason that I kind of procrastinated on reading it for 2 years is because I realized it just is not my thing. I'm just not interested in it, but it does have a beautiful cover. Then in April, I had 3 books that I DNF'd. The first one was Palace of Illusions by Chitra Banerjee Divakaruni. This is a retelling of the Mahabharata, and I was very excited about this. I was really hoping to love it, but it ended up not really doing what I look for out of this type of book. So this is a retelling of the epic, the Mahabharata, but it's from the perspective of Panchali, who is a woman in the story that we don't usually get her perspective. And that's a concept in books that, you know, I've seen many times in either retelling history or mythology. And I'm always very intrigued by it. But usually what I'm looking for out of that kind of story is like a level of detail of what their lives were like and what were their day-to-day lives were like, not just kind of what were they doing during different points of the larger story. And I felt like this one moved a lot faster than I was looking for, and it just didn't seem to focus on the things that I was hoping for it to focus on. For example, the main character, Panchali, she marries the 5 Pandava brothers, so she has 5 husbands. And that's said on the back of the book, like that's not a spoiler for it. And the arrangement that they come to essentially is that she will live as each one's wife for 1 year. So she'll live with one of them for a year and be his wife, and then the next year she'll go to the next one, and so on, and she'll kind of cycle through them. And that's a very interesting arrangement, and I would have been very interested to see what that was like for her, because that seems like it would be very difficult. But the story kind of tells us that that's what the arrangement is and then moves on in the plot, whereas what I would have wanted would have been to kind of sit with that and experience with her, like, what is it like that she just married 5 strangers and now she has to live with one of them as his wife for a full year, and what is their dynamic like? What is their relationship like? What is it like building a relationship knowing that you're gonna have to go live with someone else after 1 year? And then when that happens, when she goes and lives with the next brother after a year, what is that transition like? What is the other brother like? How is their dynamic different? Like, that's the kind of stuff that I really would have wanted to know and read about, but that's not what the book was focusing on. It was more so focusing on the plot of what they were doing during other events of the epic. So yeah, I think this one just like wasn't for me because what it was setting out to do wasn't actually what I was looking for out of this type of story. Then the next book that I DNF'd was Lost in the Never Woods by Aiden Thomas. This was not necessarily a surprise to me that it was a DNF because I knew there was a chance I might not like it. So Aiden Thomas wrote Cemetery Boys, which was one of my favorite books last year, which is why I really wanted to try their new book. But there are certain things about this. For one thing, it's a Peter Pan retelling, and I don't like Peter Pan, so I knew that I might not like this, but I still wanted to give it a try because I had enjoyed their other books so much. I also had heard from people that this is very different from Cemetery Boys and that it kind of leans a little more horror, which I think is true. I would not necessarily categorize this as horror, but I definitely see it kind of leans that way more so. But yeah, I ended up DNFing this. I'm not actually, how far into this did I get? I don't think I marked where I ended. But I just found that, for one thing, I still don't like Peter Pan. And so having a Peter Pan retelling just wasn't working for me. And also I think that it just didn't focus on the characters as much as I was hoping for. One of the things that I loved so much about Cemetery Boys was that while there was a plot, that kind of took a back seat to the characters and relationships. And I think this one focused more on the plot than the characters, so it just wasn't like working for me. But I definitely will be trying other things from Aiden Thomas in the future. It seems like they are writing things in a lot of different genres, so I'm very curious to see. Maybe the next one will work for me. We'll see. The angle might be slightly different because I had to replace my camera battery, but the next book that I DNF'd was Savage Her Reply by Deirdre Sullivan. I was very surprised that I ended up DNFing this because I was really expecting to love it, but this is a retelling of The Children of Lear from the perspective of the sorceress who curses the children and turns them into swans. So this is her telling her story and kind of why she did what she did. And there were things that I enjoyed about this book, but there were also things that I really didn't like about it. So some of the things that I did like is that I like the concept, for one thing. I also did really enjoy a lot of elements of the writing because it is very beautifully written. It's written in a way that almost feels like poetry. It almost feels like you're reading a book written in verse, but it's not exactly, but it has this very poetic feel. There are actual poems in it that are these little like poems. I don't know how well this is going to show up, but they're written in the form of Ogham characters, which is an ancient form of writing. And those would kind of break up, I guess, like the chapters. And I really enjoyed those little like poems that were dispersed throughout because I think they would sort of talk about the emotions of the character in the following chapter, and I really liked how those were integrated. There were some stylistic choices that the author made that I was not a fan of, which were, for one thing, there were long passages that would either be very repetitive or would just be like listing things. For example, like the beginning of the book is just 2 pages of her listing things, saying like, I am older than books, I am older than keep cups, I am older than the internet, I am older than trains. And then eventually she gets on to like, I am younger than thirst, I am younger than bread, I am younger than spells, I am younger than trees. It's just 2 pages of her listing things that she is older than or younger than. And I think that was a stylistic choice. I think that that is meant to mimic, there are some like traditional forms of storytelling or poetry that would either be very repetitive or kind of have these long lists of things. So I understand what she was going for, but I did not enjoy reading it, and there were other elements of the story that this is a book that is, I think, I guess it's character focused. There isn't much plot to it, and it has this very like stagnant feeling to the plot that I think makes these moments where then you pause even more. Like there isn't a lot of forward momentum, and then these moments of like listing or repeating things make it like kind of stall the plot even more and start to feel almost like filler. I feel like I would have enjoyed this more if it had been maybe a novella or a short story, because I just felt like there were a lot of things that weren't really necessary in this, but you know, those were stylistic choices on the part of the author. They just were not choices that I appreciated. I do think that the author did a good job of depicting this character's emotions and state of mind, because I think you do really come to understand how she feels very isolated. There are a lot of ways that she feels very used. She feels very disconnected from people. She has this kind of desperate desire to be loved, but doesn't really know how to connect with people. And there are also just people who are like using her and not being great to her. So like some of it's like her circumstances. But there are also times where like she does love her sisters, but then what happens is her sister is married to like a king or something, like I think a minor king, and has children, but then she dies, and then our main character is then married to her sister's widower and is now like the stepmother to her sister's children. And she loves her sister and she really wants to love her sister's children, but she's really struggling with connecting to them and figuring out how to love them, especially because she does not love her husband and he is not great to her. And so I feel like she does a good job of depicting her emotions and understanding her state of mind, and the main character becomes very like depressed, and she starts to isolate herself, and she has a lot of self-loathing and resentment and just all of these like emotions that I think you understand well. And yet I still felt quite a distance from this character, and I had a hard time connecting with her, even though I understood how she was feeling very well. But also because I think it did a good job of depicting her emotions, I just felt like I personally was not in the headspace to be reading this book. So I decided to DNF it because I, one, was not really enjoying it, and then I was kind of like, this is not the time for me to like be going down this road in my mind. So I decided to DNF this. Then in May, I had 3 more DNFs. The first one was Kushiel's Chosen, which is the second book in the Phaedra trilogy. The first one was Kushiel's Dart. I read Kushiel's Dart a couple months ago, and I enjoyed it. I had some critiques of it, but overall enjoyed it. I have a very long review of it, which I'll link below if you want to know what I thought of the first book. And I buddy read the first book with Chris from Chris Bookish Cauldron. We buddy read the second book before I DNF'd it. And I think there were a few reasons that I DNF'd this. One is that it kind of didn't go in the direction that I was hoping the second book in the series would go. One of my issues with the first book was that as much as there were a lot of interesting elements to it, I didn't feel very connected to the characters. And what I was hoping for in the second book was that now that this world had been established and we'd kind of established the politics and everything that was going on, that there would be more space to focus on these characters and their relationships. And that's really not what happens. It kind of dives back into focusing on the plot and the politics of this world. And I actually feel like the characters and their relationships especially took even more of a backseat in this book. Actually, let me tell you, how far did I get into this? Because I got pretty far. I got 400 pages into this book, so I gave it a good try. I tried so hard to like this. But yeah, so I felt like the characters were kind of even more taking a backseat in this one, and it was really focused on the politics of this, which I think the politics are interesting, but I just need more character stuff to happen. Also, Jocelyn's character was really annoying me in this one. There also is a dynamic that the main character, Phaedra, has with kind of the main antagonist villain of this story that I don't like their dynamic. I feel like this villain is kind of like Phaedra's Moriarty. They both are like kind of obsessed with each other, and they're like going to play the game to see who can outsmart the other, and they're like, and the villain was sort of like leaving her clues to see if she could like figure out the puzzle of like what had happened to them and all of these things. And one thing, I just am not super into that like Moriarty villain kind of dynamic, but also in this specifically, I don't understand why they're so obsessed with each other, because in the first book, like it's a character she knows from the first book, they had very few interactions, and yet Phaedra is like, this is the only person who truly understands me and who I am, and I'm the only one who truly understands who they are. And I'm like, when did that happen? You had like 2 conversations. Like, what? How did that happen that they became the person who like truly understands who you are as a person? I just don't understand why they're obsessed with each other. Like, there is kind of a magical explanation for it, but even so, I feel like I needed more of a character explanation, especially because every time Phaedra comes into contact with this person, she just like melts. She just like becomes incoherent and is like incapable of doing anything because she's so like incredibly sexually attracted to this person. And I'm like, they're a terrible person who has murdered people that you love. Like, I know that there are magical in-world reasons for this, but like, I don't know, there were magical explanations for these things, but I just felt like I needed more of an actual character explanation for this dynamic, and I didn't enjoy it. I also felt like the plot of this book was following all of the same beats as the plot of the first book. Like, for spoiler reasons, I won't tell you what they are, but this, like, I could pretty much draw out how the basic plot beats of this book exactly follows the basic plot beats of the first book. And I read some stuff later on, after I decided to DNF this, I read some stuff about the third book, and I was like, these books all have the same basic plot arc to them. And I just, like, I didn't enjoy that plot enough to want to read it 3 times. So there were a lot of things about this that I just was not interested or very engaged in the plot or the characters or the relationship dynamics, or like, and like the politics were interesting, but that's not like that's not the thing that keeps me connected to a book. That's more like, interesting politics is more of a bonus to me than like a primary interest of mine when I'm reading. And then the last thing that I didn't like about this was that the issues that I had with the Yeshuites in the first book only got worse in the second book. So for a tiny bit of context, this is alternate history fantasy. Part of the alternate history is about the religion, and in this version of the world, essentially what would have been like Judaism and Christianity never split from one another. They stayed one religion, and are called the Yeshuites because they follow Yeshua, who is the kind of Jesus figure of this world. And I have my own issues with this concept of like blending Judaism and Christianity, because there already is so much like erasure of Judaism and people acting like Judaism and Christianity are just the same thing, or Judaism is Christianity without the Jesus, and like all of these things that have their own issues. But if that's the concept of blending Judaism and Christianity together, that's not even what this did. Because in this book, we get to learn a lot more about the Yeshuites and their like religious and philosophical beliefs. And we find out that pretty much it's just Christianity, but using Hebrew terminology and using like the aesthetic of Judaism without any of the cultural, religious, or philosophical context of these things, and putting Christian like interpretations or spins on Jewish concepts, again removing them from the cultural and like religious or philosophical context of what those concepts actually are. And as I just read more and more about it, it just made me more and more uncomfortable. It felt more and more icky. I really didn't like that it was removing all of that context and really just using this like aesthetic of Judaism on what was essentially a Christian culture. And in that case, I wish that she had made some other choice. I wish that she had just created some completely new religion that didn't have the context of like blending Christianity and Judaism, or if she had just admitted that it's pretty much just Christianity, like that's what it is. It's like an ancient version of Christianity. Like, I don't know why she needed to bring Judaism into it at all, other than I guess to give it like an aesthetic for some reason. I just really didn't like it, and I think that I had more and more of an issue with it as it went on. So yeah, I was not a fan of that either. So there were just a lot of things about this that I was not enjoying, and I do still really like Jacqueline Carey's writing. So I am interested in reading other books from her, but this was definitely the kind of book that I could have easily like strung myself along and been like, oh, if I like read, you know, 2 more chapters, I'll like it more. Or if they get to this new location, then I'll like it more. Because I do like her writing. But there was a point where I had to kind of cut myself off and just realize like what she's trying to accomplish with this book is not what I am looking for out of this book. And then there are some things that she's doing that are actually making me very uncomfortable with this world that she has created. And so I just was like, you know what, I need to cut my losses, even though I read the first book, which was 900 pages. And I'm 400 pages into this book, but I had to just move on. Then I had a graphic novel that I DNF'd, which was Beautiful Darkness, and this one I was hoping I would like because it, for one thing, has this kind of like foresty setting to it, and it is said it's supposed to be kind of like a dark deconstruction of fairy tales. It just sounded like something I might be interested in. And I just really ended up not liking this. Maybe I just don't get it. I don't know. But reading it, I was like, I don't understand how this is a deconstruction of fairy tales. Like, there are some elements of this that are kind of interesting, I guess. It starts out with that there's like this little girl who has died in the forest. And then all of these little beings start like coming out of her body, and I guess they're supposed to represent different parts of her as a person and her personality or her consciousness, but they've kind of become these little people who are now like living in the forest and trying to like fend for themselves, but they don't really know how to like live outside of her body. And they become very like ruthless and destructive, but in this kind of weird way that is very innocent because they don't fully understand what they're doing or how they're harming others. And there isn't really a plot to it. And maybe that's part of the point. I don't know. I feel like I didn't understand what was the point of this. There wasn't really a story to it. There wasn't really a plot. The characters weren't very interesting. It kind of just was going from character to character, being like, look at this gross thing this person's doing. Look at this messed up thing this person did. This one's eating grubs now. Like, oh look, this one's living inside her decomposed body now. Like, it just, there wasn't much going on. It just was kind of like pointing out like weird or disturbing things each one of them was doing. So I kind of like didn't understand what the point was, and it was really boring. So yeah, it's a graphic novel. It's very short and it's mostly pictures, and yet I just couldn't bring myself to finish it because I was really bored and I just was like, why am I reading this? And then the last book that I DNF'd in May was Traitor's Moon by Lynn Flewelling. This is the third book in the Night Runner series. And this series, I just like haven't been super into it. I read the first 2 books and they were okay. The first one I thought had a lot of potential and I was willing to keep going with the series. The second one I also wasn't super into, and then it had some specific things that I really didn't like, which I talked about in my April wrap-up, which I'll link below if you want to hear more about what I didn't like about the second book. And by the time I got to the third book, I feel like the series has just kind of lost me. And I know that I think people say that the fourth book is where the series like really picks up, but I just couldn't bring myself to read this one. I kept putting it off and I finally read some of it. I got about 50 pages in. I actually tried physically reading this one because the first 2 I was reading the audiobooks, but I had heard from people that the audiobooks are not that great. Like, I didn't have a problem with them, but people were saying that the books are much better if you read them physically. So I was trying reading it physically and that didn't help. Like, I can see what people mean, that I do think there are things about the physical read that just makes it like a better reading experience, but I got about 50 pages into it and I just don't really care that much. So I think I'm going to be DNFing this one. I think it just kind of lost me. So those are all the books that I DNF'd this spring. Let me know if you have read any of them, what your thoughts are on them. Thank you all for watching, and until next time, bye!